Do I start?
Over to you, Sia.
Yeah. Good evening and a very warm welcome to one and all. This is the 16th monthly online guest lecture organized by the research scholars at the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies at Goa University. Our guest and speaker for today is Dr. Olga Lyanda-Geller, and the title of her talk is Aleksei Losev's Philosophy of Language. A few announcements before the talk. This event, along with the contents in the chat box, is being recorded. All the participants are requested to keep your microphones on mute throughout the lecture, which will go on for about an hour, after which there will be a Q&A session. I would now request Dipanki to kindly give the welcome address.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible here?
Yes,
Hello.
yes, you are.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Distinguished chief guest, respected Professor Dr. Kosi Tharakan, all the other faculty and research scholars. On the behalf of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome the guest, Dr. Olga Lyanda-Geller. Dr. Olga Lyanda-Geller is an assistant professor of Russian Jewish Studies and Comparative Literature at Puzzi University. She holds graduate degree in philosophy and philology. Dr. Lyanda-Geller's research is interdisciplinary. Her principal interest is the nature of language, which she has been exploring from both linguistic and philosophical points of view, investigating concepts ranging from the lecton in the Stoic doctrine, inner form, and symbol in the grammar tradition and Russian thought. Her work focuses on various aspects of category of meaning, different ways of expression of sense by linguistic means, and forming new concepts in language. Her current project includes research in the area of cross-disciplinary language and engineering education, classical and modern Russian and comparative literature, Jewish studies, and philosophy of music. Again, I welcome you, Dr. Olga Lyanda-Geller.
Thank you, Dipanki. I now invite Dr. Olga Lyanda-Geller to give her talk. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Sia. Thank you, Dipanki. Thank you very much, Vidya, for inviting me. Thank you, Dr. Farhan, for organizing this seminar. And excuse me, my thanks to Dr. Sophia Stone, thanks to whose seminar we got acquainted. I will now share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes,
Is it
Professor.
good? Okay, thank you. So let's start. So my talk is entitled Aleksei Losev's Philosophy of Language. My contact information is here, and I would love to hear from you to your convenience. Okay, Aleksei Fedorovich Losev, a philosopher of name, number, and essence, in his own words, is an outstanding Russian philosopher, thinker, philologist, classicist, translator, commentator, writer. The scope of his interests includes philosophy, philology, aesthetics, religion, myth, mathematics, music, and much more. A truly Renaissance figure in modern Russian culture, Losev inherited, developed, and enriched the traditions of the classical Russian thought and preserved them for future generations. The number of his publications now nears 900 of works, including dozens of monographs and major papers, and is still growing due to new publications from Losev's archive. Most of his work is still untranslated, so it's awaiting its reader. His works are being translated into English, French, Italian, and many other languages. Let's start with his biography, which by itself is a document, is a feat. Aleksei Fedorovich Losev was born on September 23rd, 1893 in the city of Novocherkassk, which is the capital city of the Don Cossacks in southern Russia. You see it on the short map there. And right left from this is Ukraine. He inherited his passion for mathematics and music from his father, Fyodor Pavlovich, who abandoned the family soon after Alexei was born. Alexei was raised by his mother, Natalia Alexeyevna, who devoted her life to bringing him up, and his grandfather, Alexei Polyakov, an Orthodox priest. Young Alexei studied in the Novocherkassk Classical Gymnasium, which created a basis for his later philological studies. There he became interested in philosophy and classical philology and got acquainted with the works of Vladimir Solovyov, who made an immense impact on Losev's intellectual development. He also studied music, violin, and was a devoted theater goer. In 1911 through 1915, Losev studied at the Historical Philological Department of Moscow University, Russia, and graduated from two departments, philosophy and classics. The tradition of classical education in Russia back then, with its ways of teaching ancient Greek and Latin language, influenced generation of scholars, Losev in particular. Just to give you one example of the level of requirements. For example, Losev's exam in classical languages that he would take with Moscow State University professors Pokrovsky and Sobolevsky consisted in translating Sophocles from the classical ancient Greek to Latin, and then to Homer's Greek. That was the level of his knowledge. The meticulous attention to details of ancient texts based on his profound knowledge of Greek and Latin became Losev's signature in his lifelong work. Still as a student, Losev became affiliated with the Vladimir Solovyov Religious Philosophical Society and the university's psychological society, where he met the Russian philosophical elite, namely Nikolai Berdyaev, Pavel Florensky, Sergei Bulgakov, Evgeny Trubetskoy, Simon Frank, and many others. He started publishing in 1916, and by 1920s, he was already a professor of aesthetics and an academician of several institutions, including the State Institute of Musical Science, State Academy of Artistic Science, and the Moscow Conservatory. In 1922, Aleksei Losev married Valentina Mikhailovna Sokolova. The wedding ceremony was performed by Father Pavel Florensky, a theologian and a philosopher himself. Valentina Mikhailovna was a mathematician and astronomer, and also shared his passion for music and philosophy. Their mutual intellectual and spiritual pursuit resulted in their secretly taken monastic vows, the fact that was released only after Losev's death. And then in later portraits, you will see a small black cap on Losev's head. That's this a sign of this early devotion to monastic vows. Losev's incredibly productive work in 1920s resulted in the famous Восьмикнижие, or an 8-volume set of books first published between 1927 and 1930. The Ancient Cosmos and Contemporary Science, 1927, The Philosophy of the Name, 1927, Music as a Subject of Logic, 1927, The Dialectics of Artistic Form, 1927, The Dialectics of Number in Plotinus, 1928, The Criticism of Platonism by Aristotle, 1929, Essays on Classical Symbolism and Mythology, Volume 1, 1930, and The Dialectics of Myth, 1930. That's an incredible amount of work, and you see all of these works, all of these monographs were published in between just a few years. And that's when the problems started, or rather continued. After the publication of the Dialectics of Myth, Losev was arrested on the formal grounds related to censorship issues, although the true reason for the arrest was the investigators' attempt to prove Losev's involvement with onomatodoxy in Yugoslavia, a religious movement glorifying God's name. This is one of the darkest pages in Losev's life and in the life of the entire Russian society. So we are deep into Stalin's purges, and Losev was one of the many, many victims of the regime. Losev was sentenced to 10 years of labor camps and sent to Belbaltlag, which is the acronym for the White Sea Baltic Canal of Camp of Gulag. Well, I don't know how much I should say about the Gulag system, but let me just say a few words. So, Gulag is a system of labor concentration camps maintained in the Soviet Union from 1930, which actually began with Solovki, the first camp, in 1918, and it lasted to 1955, a few years after Stalin's death in 1953. The word itself, Gulag, is an acronym of Russian words which translate as Main Directorate of Correctional Labor Colonies. According to the data, 18 to 25 million people passed through the Gulag's camps overall, and 5 million died. If you're interested in learning more about this very unfortunate and shameful page of Russian Soviet history, please take a look at the famous novel by Alexander Solzhenitsyn entitled The Gulag Archipelago. It was Solzhenitsyn was a 1970 Nobel Prize literature in literature laureate for, quote, the ethical force with which he has pursued the indispensable traditions of Russian literature. The Gulag Archipelago is a highly influential work that amounted to a head-on challenge to the Soviet state. This Belbaltlag was a camp where hundreds of thousands of people perished. Losev's wife was arrested as well. Losev's library and manuscripts were destroyed. Nearly everything was lost. The impossible conditions of labor left Losev almost blind for his entire life. He was released from the camp in 1932. When, after the release of Valentina Mikhailovna, his wife, the Losevs returned to Moscow, he, according to the malpractice back then, he was prohibited from publishing his philosophical research and from teaching at all major universities. So he taught at provincial institutions and kept up with his research, hoping that his work on ancient aesthetics would distract the attention of the authorities. But still, he was unable to publish except for his translation of St. Nicholas of Cusa. In 1941, when the war broke out, during a bombardment in Moscow, Losev's apartment was ruined. He lost a family member and again almost his entire library. And this second loss of his library was one of the gravest personal tragedies. Soon after receiving his doctoral degree, Losev was charged with idealism and fired from Moscow State University. So the persecutions continued. From that time and until his retirement, Losev taught at the Moscow State Pedagogical Institute. He was able to start publishing again only in 1953 after Stalin's death. In 1954, Valentina Mikhailovna passed away from cancer. Before her passing away, she blessed Losev to marry Aza Alebekovna Takhogodi, a former graduate student who lived in Losev's house after losing her father to also Stalin's scourges. During the last decades of Losev's life, despite being legally blind, with the assistance of his students, he authored a few hundreds of works, being almost completely blind, including monographs, scholarly papers, textbook chapters, and essays. One of the most outstanding events of this last period was the publication of his 8-volume History of Ancient Aesthetics, 1963 to 1988, with its systematic analysis of the entire ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and aesthetics. Despite gradually growing in recognition, Losev's relations with the officials remained strained, and he was still considered an idealist, which was impossible for the Soviet system. Only when the Soviet system was nearing its end, Losev received prestigious awards from the government, including the Order of the Red Banner of Labor awarded in 1983, when Losev's 19th anniversary was celebrated, and the USSR State Award in Philosophy in 1985. Aleksei Fedorovich Losev passed away in 1988 at the age of 94. The house of Losev, a picture of which you see on the right, is the house in Moscow where Losev lived the last 50 years, and now hosts a huge library of history of Russian philosophy and culture. He inspired generations of young Russian thinkers. His legacy is still to remain to be fully explored, but it is now being studied all over the world, and the translation work has started. Okay, let's take a look at his system and method. Losev creates an original phenomenological dialectical system, which is simultaneously rooted in the Russian Eastern Orthodox, Platonic, and Neoplatonic tradition, as well as in German idealism. It is namely an attempt of creating a philosophical system in much the same way we think about the great systems of German idealism. That was quite unusual for Russian philosophy. Characterizing Losev's idiosyncratic philosophical system and having in mind a great number of sources that influenced his worldview, one should remember that Losev always followed his philosophical program, outlines of which were formulated already in the very early period of his work. Although with the passage of time, the program's stylistic and its terminology could not remain unchanged, Losev's philosophical system demonstrated a unity of methods and approaches to analysis. Losev's interest and encyclopedic knowledge of both early sources, detailed knowledge of ancient Greek, Latin, and Renaissance texts, and modern philosophy, in particular German idealism, neo-Kantianism, and phenomenology, and of course contemporary Russian thought, however, does not imply that he should be identified with any of these traditions. Rather, following Losev's own way of defining concept apophatically, that is, a method adopted by Losev from apophatic or negative theology, which attempts to express the essence of God and the divine by eliminating all characteristics that are not to be said or attributed, so going negatively first, it is easier to say what Losev's position is not. Despite attempts to categorize Losev's position, he escapes any labeling of this kind, thus answering to the question of self-identification. Quote, "What to do with me if I do not consider myself either an idealist or a materialist or a Platonist or a Kantian or a Husserlian or a rationalist or a mystic or a sheer dialectician or a metaphysician, if even all those contrasts seem naive to me? But if a label or a sign is absolutely needed, then unfortunately I can only say this: I'm Losev." End of quote from Losev's History of Ancient Aesthetical Studies. The Western direction of Losev's thought comes from classical German idealism, to which he adds his own understanding of Husserl's phenomenology, expanding it to symbolism and mythology, and taking it closer to a type of Neoplatonism. Losev was familiar with Husserl's works, in particular with Logical Investigations and Ideas 1, and attended seminars by Gustav Speth, the main Russian Husserlian of the time, and a student of Husserl. However, Losev's own understanding of phenomenology as a discipline, describing reality with its principal orientation on meaning and being, can be traced back rather to Hegel than to Husserl. This orientation is also the point of intersection of phenomenology and neo-Kantianism in Losev's understanding of both traditions, as well as with Russian symbolism. Phenomenology is a pre-theoretical description and formulation of all possible types and degrees of meaning that are enclosed in the world on the basis of their adequate seeing, that is, seeing them in their eidos, quoted from Losev's Philosophy of Name. From the same source, phenomenology is not a theory or science. Phenomenology is viewing and seeing meaning as it exists by itself, and therefore it is totally a meaningful picture of the object. Phenomenology sets itself only one task: to give a meaningful picture of the object itself, describing it with such a method that is required by the object itself. Phenomenology is a deictic seeing of the object in its eidos. End quote. There is an interesting feature of Losev's reception of Husserl's phenomenology noted by some scholars. Despite all agreement with Husserl's phenomenological method, especially with his teaching about the manifestation of the essence, Wessenschau, Losev's phenomenological creed is missing one essential aspect of Husserl philosophy, namely the carrying out of the transcendental phenomenological reduction. In this, the general thesis of a naturalistic approach is excluded, by virtue of which there exists an awareness of our real environment as a continuously present or existing reality. This is a quote from Ahart. Although Losev's distancing from analyzing some forms of reality can be considered bracketing, phenomenological reduction epoche in Husserl's Wieland is notably missing from Losev's account. That's one major difference between Losev and Husserl. However, phenomenology alone, as a primary descriptive method to be applied to characterizing an already constructed world, is not enough for Losev. The intentionality of consciousness helps grasping the picture of the object, but it does not explain the nature of its structure or the structure of its eidos. Moreover, phenomenology is not an ideal method to deal with antinomies and controversies, which are plentiful in the real-life experience. Therefore, phenomenology should be combined with dialectics as a primarily explanatory method. Losev, at least at the time of writing his philosophy of name, 1927, takes dialectics as a tool that can explain things meaningfully, unlike other disciplines, including, for example, metaphysics, psychology, and formal logic, which can also provide with explanations, but their explanations usually remain within the limits of naturalistic explaining. They might offer psychological or metaphysical explanations as well, but Losev is looking for an explanation that will aim at the sphere of meaning. He finds it in dialectics understanding it as logic that, quote, must be beyond the laws of identity and contradiction, that is, it must be a logic of contradiction, end quote, philosophy of name. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics has to cleanse from the point of view of a logic if contradiction, all of those problems that metaphysics used to deal with, and has to provide with a logical construction of the antinomic synthetic formation of the things of real experience. Contrary to phenomenology, dialectics has to not only give a description of separately given moments of meaning, but also to explain meaning in all its meaningful connections. One category should be explained by another so that it would be seen how one category generates another, and all of them together generate each other not naturalistically but eidetically, categorically, still remaining in the sphere of meaning. From the same source, phenomenology of meaning, philosophy of name. From his early works and until his late period, Losev keeps exercising his live dialectical scene of the world. Philosophy was a very live experience for Losev. Dialectics is a key term in many titles of Losev's monographs and papers, and this is not accidental. Losev's vision is organically dialectical in his own understanding of the concept, naturally. Losev outlines it throughout his entire work, but he remains loyal to the main definition that we find already in the philosophy of name. Dialectics is the only method capable of grasping the living reality as a whole. First, true dialectics is always the immediate knowledge. Second, dialectics is the authentic and solely possible philosophical realism. Third, dialectics is abstract. But then how can it be an immediate foundation of life? Because dialectics is the rhythm of life. Fourth, dialectics stands on the point of view of absolute empiricism. Dialectics is both absolute empiricism and absolute rationalism, and you will understand it truly only when you take those two contradictory claims synthetically as something integral. Philosophy of name. So, in conformity with his program, Losev defines his method as phenomenologo-dialectical or phenomenological-dialectical in his own understanding of both phenomenology and dialectics. You've heard this already a lot, and you will continue hearing this for whichever term I have to add in Losev's own understanding of the term, because that's how he constructs his system. We can find the application of the method of Losev's analysis of the main categories of his system, including name, number, symbol, myth, and artistic form, among many others. The Eastern direction of Losev's approach starts with Russian Neoplatonism, particularly in Solovyov's version. In his further development of this tradition, Losev seeks to defend and reconcile some controversies in Imeslavia, which is a Russian term coined back then. It's usually translated as onomatodoxy or glorifying the name. What was this? Imeslavia, or onomatodoxy, started as a teaching in Russian Orthodox philology in the beginning of the 20th century. It was formally caused by the book entitled On the Caucasus Mountains, authored by the Eskimo monk named Hilarion. The book discusses the mystic experience during a special prayer when the name of Christ is mentioned many times. Coming from hesychasm, a mystical tradition of contemplative smart player or intelligent player, it was regarded as a living, intimate conversation with God. Hilarion claims, though not dogmatically, that God is present in his name. The book ignited a theological dispute of Mount Athos monks who debated whether God's name contains God's essence or God's energy, or whether it's a pure humanly nomination. The supporters of Imeslavia, onomatodoxy, argued that yes, God is present in his name, more dogmatically or less dogmatically. While their adversaries, proponents of imeborchestvo in the original, which translates as onomatoclasm, fighting the name, insisted on the opposite. No, that's not the case. God is not present in his name. Imeslavia was condemned by the Russian Church. The theological question was not resolved, and the discussion of name, its energy, and ontological meaning was continued by Russian philosophers. Russian philosophers are preoccupied with the power of language and the nature of the world, and that was the signature feature of Russian philosophy of the time, in particular for Pavel Florensky, Sergei Bulgakov, and Aleksei Losev. These three philosophers approached the debate antinomically. The doctrine that resulted from the philosophical reinterpretation of onomatodoxy in 1910-1920s in Russian philosophy was later called the philosophy of name. Losev used antonymics as a methodological principle in many of his works, in particular the dialectics of myth and the dialectics of artistic form. But whenever he needs to define a concept, he constructs an elaborate system of dialectic antinomies to apophatically, that is negatively, discard everything of what the concept is not, coming to a conclusion about the content of the concept through a phenomenological dialectical revealing of its formula. So whatever work you take, you will have a really elaborate and involved discussion, which normally starts with this apophatic approach, primarily due to the fact that the categories that Losev works with are really difficult categories to define. So he starts with what the concept is not, carefully eliminating all these extra layers, finally coming to the core of the concept. This is especially seen in his treatment of the main principles of onomatodoxy. Transferring the dogmatic theological assertion that the name of God is God himself into the philosophical domain, Losev, following Florensky in particular, the principles formulated in Florensky's in Imeslavia or onomatodoxy as a philosophical premise, comes to the antinomical conclusion, that the name of God is God, but God himself is not his name. This is how Losev summarizes his thesis about the discussion. God's name is an energy of God's essence, number one. Number two, God's name as an energy of God's essence is inseparable from the essence itself, and therefore is God himself. 3. Concerning the symbolic nature of God's names. God's name is God himself. God himself is not his name. 4. God's name is not just a sound and requires worshipping. 5. In God's name there is a meeting of man and God. The pronounced name is a point of meeting of divine and human energies. Losev was greatly sympathizing with the main principles of this religious movement, but it was not free from certain naivety and lacked systematicity. Losev understands Imyaslavia as a type of symbolism and contrasts it to naturalism due to the extreme importance that the name, the Imya part in Imyaslavia, bears qua an expression of the essence. Losev's continued work in this direction results in creating a communicative theory of energetic symbolism. Synthetic by nature, this theory departs from Neoplatonic dialectics and combines it with the Western methodology described above. Now let's take a look at one of the very central categories of Losev's philosophy of language, or metaphysics of language, if you prefer, and his philosophy in general. To illustrate how Losev's system and method work, let us take a look at one of his major books. Together with other Losev's early essays from the 8-volume set, the philosophy of name explores the powers of his phenomenological dialectical method. The philosophy of name, written in 1923 and published in 1927, the most Husserlian work in this early 8-work corpus, is quite challenging for the reader. I must admit, the most challenging work. But this is not because of Losev being too scholastic. Losev builds up an elaborate antinomics, or the multi-level system of antinomies of name, inviting his reader to follow him in his really intricate examination of the dynamic development of the structure of the word name, from its pre-objective structure to its objective structure to their synthesis. It takes Losev to go through 67 moments, as he calls them, of analysis to track the evolution of the word. He first explores the initial potential of the word, starting with the easy part of the physical appearance of the word, phoneme, morpheme, sememe, how the word looks, how it sounds, what it means. Next, he proceeds to eidos, the concrete ideal meaning, and then through its dissolution of the meon, or inabytia in Russian, the other being, the non-being, and thanks to logos, through its inverse becoming, it finally comes to understanding the world as symbol and as in its full intelligence. This analysis leads Losev to this really intricate definition of name, to which he comes after carefully exploring these many moments of name's structure. The definition goes as follows. A name is a meaningful, expressed, or implied energy of the essence in the mode of the intelligent self-relatedness, given as an arena of communication of the fact, the meonized meaning, with the eidos, the meaning in itself, or given as a meaningful meeting of the subject with its object. In short, name is an energetically expressed, meaningfully symbolic element of myth that has given the meaning to one or another meon and thus brought it to a meaning with itself. Even shorter, name is an energetically expressed, meaningfully symbolic and magic element of myth. These shortenings should help, but to fully appreciate what this means and what is behind all these symbols and concepts, I would encourage you to read whatever translation of Losev's work you can find. And this particular work is not translated yet into English, but it is translated to other languages. A symbolically realized intelligence is myth. This is why name always expresses the essence of a thing, and the process of naming makes the world meaningful. To summarize Losev's 67 moment of analysis, we can say that, yes, a symbolically realized intelligence is myth, and a symbolically realized myth or actualized myth is person. So we see this very close connection between name, myth, and person, the actual human being. The synthesis of body and meaning realized in the person is the name or the absolute living being. So you see dialectics as a method at works. It's all about life. It's all about living being. Bringing together the categories of name, person, symbol, and myth is not accidental. In Losev's system, they are always interrelated and usually mutually defined. For example, this is how myth gets its definition in the Dialectics of Myth, 1930. This is my favorite book by Losev. It is now translated into English. Thank you to Professor Vladimir Marchenkov. You see the book, a picture of both books in the original and in English translation on the right on the screen. I highly encourage you to read this. This is the liveliest of Losev's books. I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did. So the Dialectics of Myth is the last work from the 8-volume set and the last work for many years because, as we just saw, this was followed by Losev's arrest. The definition the main definition of myth from this book has very little to do with the conventional approach to myth and mythology. Exercising Losev's apophatic approach in defining categories, he systematically eliminates what myth is not. First, myth is not a figment, fiction, or fantastic invention. And then Losev goes into really detailed account explaining why myth is not that, given many examples in this particular book, which is not very characteristic of Losev. For example, in Philosophy of Name, you can hardly find any examples at all. It's just pure theory. That's why it's one of his most complicated works. You have to understand all this dialectically, abstractly. So myth is not a figment, fiction, or a fantastical invention. 2, myth is not some ideal being. 3, myth is not a scientific construction and not even a primitively scientific construction. 4, myth is not a metaphysical construction. That is, it's not a construction at all. 5, myth is not a scheme or allegory. Nor 6, is it a poetic work. 7, it is not a specifically religious product. 8, it's not a tenet. 9, it's not a historic event as such. Accordingly, mythology is not to be identified with science, metaphysics, art, religion, or history, as it's usually done. So what is myth, then, if it's not all of that? When everything superfluous is excluded, Losev provides a few cataphatic, positive considerations where myth is defined as, and in the book you will have a huge definition, but to help his readers understand what it is, Losev again breaks it down to different moments, and you can be sure that each moment, his definition, is clearly and carefully defined. First, myth is a miracle. 2, myth is an image of person. You will always see the concept of person, no matter where you are in Losev's philosophical system. 3, it's a personal history given in words, and finally is given its immanent dialectical formula for an unfolded magical name taken in its absolute being, quoted from Dialectics of Myth. As such, a myth does not only belong to antiquity. Myth, mythology, and mythologization are present in modern societies as well. So myth is as alive as ever. And the failure to see that is a prejudice or short-sightedness. Losev encourages us to see and to appreciate myths in our everyday life, in our everyday readings. Myth is very much alive. So for Losev, myth is not a fiction, fairy tale, or metaphor. There is nothing artificial in myth. It is miraculous and magical, but simultaneously very real, alive, and corporeal. And to finally given one big overview to Losev's later works, let me guide you through one of Losev's greatest achievements, and this is his views on aesthetics. So one of Losev's greatest works in his late period is an exceptionally fine and colossal work entitled History of Ancient Aesthetics. The reader should not be misled by the title. By using the term aesthetics, Losev was trying to divert his censor's attention from the fact that he was actually giving a systematic analysis of the entire philosophic and aesthetic history of the antiquity. We should keep in mind that Losev was still under constant watching eye, and he was not allowed to do pure philosophy. So he turned his attention to aesthetics, but he was masking his philosophical views under aesthetics, although he was genuinely interested in aesthetics as well. Such an integral study turned out possible because Losev considered the ancient worldview as a whole and regarded ancient aesthetics, philosophy, and mythology in their unity. The history of ancient aesthetics was being written and published for a few decades. Among forerunners of this work, we can name most of works from Losev's early 8-volume set. Losev had an idea of writing a monumental work focusing specifically on history of ancient aesthetics, based on a course that he offered in the Moscow Conservatory. He prepared a manuscript and tried to publish its first part, but unsuccessfully. The entire manuscript was lost during the August 12, 1941 bombardment in Moscow. So later on, he had to reconstruct the entire lost manuscript from scratch. Having in mind that he was essentially blind, you can imagine what amount of work this required. And he had most of the quotations he needed from ancient authors in his mind. So he was extracting them from his memory, and then he asked his students to check out the sources, still working with mostly ancient Greek and Latin sources. Losev resumed his work on aesthetics at the end of the war, starting again from the very beginning. In 1963, the first volume, The Early Classics, was published, and since then, there appeared 7 more volumes, including the last 2 that consisted of 2 books. If we add here 2 more works that are thematically close to the cycle, The Aesthetics of Renaissance, 1978, and The Hellenistic Roman Aesthetics, 1978, which of course are not do not belong to history of ancient aesthetics, but a rather more modern period, but still thematically they are very close. Then we get an unparalleled 10-volume edition with more than 8,000 pages in total. This is a colossal work and parallel work in the world of humanitarian studies. Losev's views of ancient aesthetics are synthetic. He sees their interweaving of philosophy, mythology, symbolism, art, science, religion, and morality. Aesthetics is not just a science of the beautiful. It is primarily a study of different expressive forms of being and spirit, a study of an external expressivity of the inner world. As such, aesthetic categories naturally include not only the beautiful, but also the ugly. The forms of expressivity include the tragic and the comic, the pathetic and the grotesque, in different degrees of their perfection, including the highest as well as the lowest. Losev reconstructs the ancient world in its richness in originality, based on multiple facts from philosophical, historical, literary, linguistic, scientific, and artistic materials. That is, for Russian and not only Russian readers who did not know antiquity as part of their culture, Losev shows the beauty of the ancient world in the development of its life spirit and shows the unity of ancient culture in its spiritual and material aspects. So we literally hear the voice of antiquity, the old voices, sound for us in the liveliest possible form. And since aesthetics for Losev is a study of symbol, expression, and expressivity, all external manifestations of the inner spirit, including not only different forms of art, but also myth, language, mathematics, are involved into an aesthetics discussion. This interpretation of the concept of aesthetics that Losev outlined already in his early works reflects his interest spanning his entire life, and philosophy of language plays a huge role there. This is where I would like to stop and to open the floor for discussions. Let me mention that Losev's bibliography in the original Russian is immense. And if you go to the webpage of Losev's house, unfortunately, it's mostly in Russian only, but the translation work is also being done there. You'll see enormous bibliography, both on Losev's part and the criticism. Let me mention that there are only very few translations into English as of to the date. I would specifically mention translation by Oleg Buchkov of Losev's Dialectics of Artistic Form, published in 2013 in Germany. And the aforementioned translation by Vladimir Morchenkov of Losev's Dialectics of Myth. Both works are highly recommended, and both works have a foreword by the translator and editor, Professor Morchenkov and Professor Buchkov. Correspondingly, and they both or either of them would be a really nice introduction to Losev system in general. We are lucky that in later years of Losev's life, people were able to film him, although this mostly refers to the very last years of his life and work. But still, a documentary is available. That's a 1-hour documentary in Russian with no subtitles yet, but this can be done. Director Viktor Kosakovsky. And even if you don't speak Russian, you can take a look at the link here. And I can copy it in the chat if needed. And you will see Losev live. You will see. Sorry?
No, please continue, Professor Olga. Some external disturbance. Please continue.
No problem. Do you want me to copy this in the chat?
No,
or
please continue.
later?
It was, I think, one of the participants forgot to.
No problem. I'm just asking whether you want me to copy the link or this can
Yes,
be done
please.
later. Okay, so here is the link. And I would show you some excerpts, but okay. Where is the chat? Okay, if you don't mind, I'll do it later. So you can have the image of Losev and you can hear his voice. And maybe I can ask my students to do some closed capture translation works, the subtitles. The bibliography in English is now growing, and there were a few volumes already dedicated entirely to Losev, in particular volume 35 of the Russian Studies in Philosophy, and volume 56 of the Studies of in East European Thought. And you see some names in particular mentioned as parts of these volumes or separately. So very unfortunate, most of his works are still not available to the non-Russian speaking world, but I hope that this will be done soon and the world will enjoy his works. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am waiting for the questions.
Thank you, Professor. We can now move to the question and answer session. Anyone who has a question can either type it in the chat box or you can ask it directly by raising your hand. The raise hand icon will be at the bottom of your screen. Yes, Dr. Nandakumar Kamath, you can ask your
It's
question.
not necessary that we should ask questions because we can also think for ourselves on most of these topics. And that's why I feel that the forum should be rather of, in especially philosophy department, uh, we should rather have a discourse. And we also have some, at least I have some original ideas and thoughts as a scientist also in the whole area of aesthetics. And first of all, a word of protest and regret, that is both communist China, what it has lost in cultural revolution, and Soviet, which lost so many things due to the persecution of the intellectuals and all. We cannot bring all that back, because what Dr. Olga has told us, and she has also written a interesting article on his life and work, which makes you very sad basically at the end of it, because it is rather luck, I would say, that, and maybe it is a divine justice that he could live almost to become a centenarian. And the regret is for, the several events we read in his life, which Dr. Olga, you have put before the world in very few but very effective words, that he had to suffer a lot while in Russia before he was persecuted and imprisoned. And it makes you very sad, because you know that this is the story of the boldest of the philosophers, right from Socrates, I believe. In fact, the last moments of Socrates were in front of me when I was reading all that and listening to you also. Now, my some of the points which I wish to make here is, yes, it looks like that his idea of developing the whole field of aesthetics was an interdisciplinary idea. And if you even see the natural science or applied science or anything in the science, we also believe that the whole biosphere, right from biosphere to the species level to the molecular level, that the principles of aesthetics, they are fully applicable. It is not just the words and the creative arts or performing arts or literature or whatever, dance, music, paintings, sculpture. That is where we see the aesthetics, or only natural landforms, the clouds, the rain, the changing seasons, that we see aesthetics, or we can describe aesthetically this type of human experience. I believe that we have to extend his ideas further in the field of experimental science also, because the scientists also get a very profound feeling of experiencing something beautiful, but they can't always describe it. What is the beauty of their discovery or invention? Would you like to comment on this? Because I have not read much in this area of application of its principles to scientific discoveries, inventions, and experience that scientists get. Can you comment on this if you can?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamad, for your commentary and the question. Yes, absolutely. So to the first part of one of the first comments of yours, yes, it's immensely sad we lost an immense part of Russian culture due to the purges. And let me just mention another very unfortunate event, or fortunate, depending on how you look at that. This past November, December, we commemorated the anniversary of the so-called philosophical ship, or the philosopher's steamboat. This is an event which happened exactly 100 years ago, when, according to Lenin's orders, they exiled many leading figures of Russian intelligentsia, and since the majority of them left Russia by ship, by sea, and many of them are philosophers, including Sergei Bulgakov, Nikolai Berdyaev, Nikolai Losev. The the phenomenon received the name of a philosopher's steamboat. So those who were exiled, they survived. One of the people whom I mentioned today, Gustav Speth, one of the first Russian phenomenologists, he also was on the list for deportation, but he managed to get out from the list, and very unfortunately he perished in Stalin's purges. And so did Father Pavel Florensky, whom I also mentioned. So Losev was arrested and imprisoned, but he survived. Many others did not. So, and absolutely yes, to what you said in the beginning of your comment. And what we see now with many leading culture figures in Russian culture, Russian intelligence also fleeing Russia because of this war in Ukraine. This event is now already receiving a new term, newly coined term, philosopher's plane, because people live by plane, but the phenomenon is still the same. Thank you very much for your question on experimental science. Losev did not do much of that, although he was interested in primarily mathematics and music, which he loved to take together. And I can say that these are the two primary directions in which I would imagine this experimental application could go in a very practical way. Another thing that deserves much attention, and I believe the future also lies here, is that in Losev's philosophy of language, he was really interested in the primary word, the divine word, which serves as a guarantor for the entire system to work. And the particular people's languages, our natural languages, are emanations of this divine word. And this is how the vector of sense is moving. And this is where I can see a future application of say computational linguistics, artificial intelligence, trying to see how, trying to extract this core meaning, this primary meaning, and to see, to probably model these vectors of sense. Of course, I do not mean that this will exhaust the process. You still need a human being, a live human spirit to do this, but this is where I can see the applications, some applications.
Thank you, Professor Olga. Just another, random thought which comes to my mind, because I've never read Losev. Even now, whatever familiarity I have is from your talk today, and also I saw the abstract at that time. But what I'm trying to think is, could we, read Losev's philosophy as a precursor to what present-day analytic philosophers talk about as speech act, speech act theories in language, because I see he links this notion of pronouncing a name, though it might have originated from Hesychism, as you said, but I think at the philosophical level, particularly in the context of philosophy of language, there is this potential of reading his writings in terms of speech act theory. So I would like to hear your views on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koshi. Yes, I'm not sure how much Losev himself would agree with such an approach. And I'm not sure to what extent he would welcome the entire, pragmatics of modern philosophy of language. That's why I'm a little bit hesitant to call the entire thing a philosophy of language, because it immediately evokes some connotations in modern American philosophy of language, with which Losev would not have many intersections. Answering to your question, and I also see a question on the chat, are there any similarities between Ricoeur's and Losev's concepts of myth? Whoever who asked this question, thank you. Yes, I would say there are many more parallels between the continental philosophy of language. Let's call this entire domain metaphysics of sense, metaphysics of language, just not to confuse it with pragmatics of sense, so to speak. But still, yes, speech act theory, I can see where it can be applied. Losev was not such a proponent of analyzing, sentences in the way that a modern philosophy of language, especially American kind of it, does. But he was very much interested in the living human world, exactly the conversations as we lead them now. So yes, absolutely. This is not the work that has been done, so I guess it will be done in the future, because Losev's theory is so rich, so compelling. So naturally, people will try to see intersections with the speech act theory. Although, again, probably this is not the most obvious direction, and probably you would see many more intersections between, say, Losev and Bakhtin in terms of dialogue, because of this living word, live word. Another person whom I would mention, and this is also another name which is unfairly not well known. Let me spell his name in the chat. Jean Gebser. Absolutely astonishingly, Jean Gebser, a few decades after Losev and, well, simultaneously with him in the 20th century, constructs a very similar system. They didn't know each other. I mean, Losev totally could not know Gebser. The name was not known in Russia, and Gebser likely could not know much of Losev, because Losev was not translated or even published in Russia back then. But they both have the very same metaphysical grounds, only with the assumption that Losev's philosophy is primarily religious and Gebser's philosophy is not. But they are both very close to each other, not knowing that, in their big systematic things, in particular in their concept of primary words, which are at the very core of their systems. And from that, the rest proceeds and can be guaranteed. So this is not exactly speech acts, but the way I see Losev could argue this could work is that in the core of any speech act, there is these glimpses of primary words, and that's how we understand each other. That's how and why communication dialogue is possible.
Thank you, Olga, for that clarification. I mean, I just asked it because there are also readings of Austin, who in analytical tradition talked about speech act as a kind of phenomenological work. Austin's speech act is a phenomenology. There are readings, so that's the context I raised the question. Thank you for your clarification. Thank you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's also another very interesting phenomenological approach. But as I mentioned, when Losev says phenomenology or dialectics or mythology or anything, we should keep in mind that's to be understood in his particular understanding of these terms. So Losev's phenomenology is different from Husserl's phenomenology and Hegel's phenomenology, although it's close to them, and it's very different from Austin's phenomenology or Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. There's a question in the chat box by Vidya, I guess. Are there any similarities between Ricker's and Losev's concepts of myth?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Vidya, for this question. I'd say the main similarity is that they both take myth very real. It's not fictional. It's a live reality which does not belong to antiquity or any other particular epoch. It's what is being created and recreated right now. And this is just our reality. This is how we live. One of the differences is that Ricker's concept of myth should be inscribed in his hermeneutics. So he mostly applies this to his readings of texts. Losev is not that much into philosophy of literature, which is interesting because he creates literature, his philosophical literature. But yeah, they both are very much inclined to see myth in real life and everywhere. And I'd say they both share an admiration towards myth. So myth is not a dead or artificial construction or just some figment of imagination, and therefore can be just dispersed or ignored. Myths is how we live because they constitute our reality, and the primary connection between myth and something else in Ricoeur's case would be myth and literature, this kind of word, and for Losev, the word of language, the word of religious texts, although he didn't do theology, he did a philosophy with religious premises. Also, for Losev, you should also take a look at his concept of a symbol, about which I didn't talk much today. And you can find some of that in Ricoeur's thought as well, but in Losev's philosophy, a symbol is just one of the very central concepts. And that's an inseparable unity of many aspects, which also contribute to symbol being very much alive.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Nandakumar Kamath has raised a hand. Over to you, sir.
First of all, a comment because comment on artificial intelligence. Basically, all technology is extension of human consciousness, and the whole world, right from beginning of civilization, one can see always divided between technophilic and technophobic people, the entire humanity at any given point in the history, that we'll see that there is technophilia and technophobia both go hand in hand together. And I can't pass any judgment on this because the real ethical concern about from any philosophical or ethical point of view is we are not so much afraid or scared or whatever it is concerned about artificial intelligence as we are concerned about autonomous artificial intelligence or self-programming artificial intelligence. Fortunately, he expired before all this discussion began and artificial intelligence became a reality. And now we see the discourse which is currently going on in the world. And definitely, when people look at his work, perhaps they may get some ideas or inspiration. My second comment is from historical point of view, because definitely I will look into any biography or autobiography of this philosopher and try to read it because it looks very interesting, his entire life. But I'm more interested in knowing whether he had any contacts with Indian intellectual and Sanskrit scholars who used to visit Soviet Union for studies and research and interaction with Russian scholars. For example, Acharya Dharmanand Kosambi, Rahul Sanskriti, and all of them had landed in Russia. And they did a lot of work, lot of research also. And Indians were also very interactive with Russian scholars, writers, Mahatma Gandhi, Leo Tolstoy interaction. All this was going on. So I was curious to know, since we are discussing basically, the important contribution in aesthetics, whether in any area he has referred to classical Indian aesthetics. Say, for example, we have a lot of here discussion and research and critical essays on comparative Indian and classical Greek aesthetics for Abhinav Gupta, Anandavardhan, Kashmir School of Aesthetics, Natya Shastra, Navarasas. All these are fairly well known in the Western countries also, Germany and England and many other countries. So I was wondering whether Indian School of Classical Aesthetics or other Sanskrit aestheticians, whether they were referred by him, since the work was definitely available in Soviet Russia when he was at the peak of his writing. What is your your discovery regarding this reference to Indian School of Classical Aesthetics.
Thank you very much, Dr. Namkumar. As far as I know, well, I haven't seen any direct references in Losev to the Sanskrit school. As far as I know, he did not know Sanskrit himself, although he was very much interested in all the languages. I do not know whether these sources were known to him, although they were available in the Soviet Union. You see, he himself was not allowed to do many things, and he was so restricted in his means. I don't know whether he could have access to the sources, even they were available in the libraries. Also, please add to that he was almost completely blind. So if anything were available to him, that would be through his students' readings. And to find the sources, someone should have directly referred him to them. To the best of my knowledge, but I will look into that more, I don't believe he used these sources in his work.
Thank you, Professor. There's a question in the chat box by Kriti Singh. How do we know reality because knowledge is relative?
Thank you, Kriti. That's not a simple question. And well, I guess you're asking not me, but how would Losev answer this question? You see, Losev primarily is an ontologist, as most of Russian thinkers of the time. He's much more interested in being the reality itself, not knowledge we can have about it or the ways we can have this knowledge. So therefore, it's not the question that Losev would ask or answer. For him, the reality is just present. We perceive it. And since, again, his philosophy is grounded in religious foundations, there is a guarantor to our ultimate knowledge, namely God. But this question is an agnosiological question, and this is just, it's not that it's beyond the scope of what he does, definitely it's not. It's just not the way he would pose the question. It's rather through which essences or beings do we know this, and the answer to that is in some of the primary titles of our today's discussion. That's myth, that's name, that's definitely and primarily a symbol. And the variety, the richest variety of all these forms, symbolic forms, aesthetic forms that you see around us, is how we see, understand, cognize the world, and how we creatively reproduce the world. I don't know if that answers your question. But this is simply not the question that Russian philosophy of language asks, because that's the philosophy of logos, which is by itself the word, the knowledge. That's how.
Thank you, ma'am. There's another question in the chat box. Can aesthetics serve as a culture of domination to subdue, appropriate the aesthetics of emancipation of the subordinated? It's a question by Professor Ladu Nathan. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Professor Loredan. Excuse me if I mispronounced your name as well. Aesthetics, there are two dimensions of this term. There is aesthetics as, well, science, And there is aesthetics as well, aesthetic per se, the lively practice. Whether it can serve as a culture of domination, I'm not exactly sure what you mean here, so I would probably ask for a clarification. Aesthetics, Losev takes aesthetics as the whole, so I wouldn't see how he would make a hierarchy of different principles there. They are all there. So I'm not sure whether subordinated is how Losev would approach this. So again, if you ask this on Losev's behalf, I would say that's just the culture. That's the primary way of expression of culture. Unless I understand your question wrong, then please correct me.
Any follow-up question to this? Okay, so I think almost all the questions were taken up. If you all still have a question, you're okay. Yeah, go ahead, Professor.
Oh,
Hello?
thank you. Thank you, Dr. Olga, for your presentation. My question previously, just you mentioned, can we speak of an aesthetics of the people, of a culture,
Mhm.
of those people who have been subdued, subordinated, appropriated by the dominant, and projected as the only form of aesthetics? So, can we speak of an aesthetics of emancipation, a voice of those who have been marginalized
Thank
in terms of their worldview? And whatever you said, sense making, right? Expression of pathology from the point of view of the speaker that you mentioned.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nathan. Now I understand what you're asking. Yes, absolutely. And his many volume history of aesthetics is a proof of that, because this is where you hear the voices. This is how any culture, including the cultures of subdued, are heard. This is exactly how he tries to reconstruct this ancient culture with all its positive and negative moments. And yes, since our cultures are melting pots of many cultures, many voices, yes, aesthetics is one of the most powerful means of expressing people's concerns, worries, and ultimate means of creativity. So yes, absolutely. Whichever way you understand aesthetics, in a more artistic or less artistic way, but yeah, that's the way
Thank you.
how creativity is born and can be
I
heard.
know. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. If you all still have, yes, over to you, Dr. Kamath.
I have a question in a form of a statement. Now, from the point of view of aesthetics, Professor Olga, what shall we choose? I am making one statement, the two statements. Which one shall we choose? And this is a catchy statement that I will make. I just coined that statement because I was trying to solve a sort of a aesthetic puzzle. And it is like a puzzle also. It may be contradictory also. It may be, I would say, sort of, I don't know what to say about it, but there are two statements I will make, and from point of view of aesthetics, any school of aesthetics, which statement shall we choose? And you can say that maybe aesthetic is relative, depends on what school of aesthetics you belong, whether it is aesthetics rooted in religious beliefs, then the whole question of what is religion, who invented it, why it was invented, all these things matter, and we go in different directions. So basically, I will make two statements and leave it to you to choose or not to answer at all. But first statement is all newly born human babies are ugly. All newly born human babies are ugly. And the second statement is all newly born human babies are beautiful. From point of view of aesthetics, which statement we should accept?
Well, thank you very much. That's a provocative question, of course. And first of all, back to your previous claim when you said that aesthetics is rooted in religion. Not necessarily for Losev. Aesthetic is how the culture portrays and communicates itself, and it's not necessarily through religion. So that's a comment there. Second, in Losev's system, if you're asking about Losev's system, again, this is not how the claims are to be evaluated, because this is simply not something that he does. All babies are this or that. Well, if to choose here, I say from the common human perspective, definitely the second. But this is not in terms of his aesthetics. And it's not a sentence analysis, it's not a proposition or judgment analysis. It's primarily about creativity. So it's not about an assessment of what some natural phenomena are. It's mostly how the human spirit creatively transcends its limit. So it's not about a physical beauty or ugliness of natural phenomena. It's not about this. It can be about assessing something, but it's not about claim A versus claim B. So I'm not sure why you want us to choose in between those two claims.
This is the problem with human civilization, that we refuse to take stand because we are prisoners of our own, perhaps, that hypothesis or whatever. The fundamental question is this: the human baby is an innocent product. It is never asked to be born. And that particular, that living soul has come into existence. So we have to really look from that angle of aesthetics, because we consider from any fundamental precept of religion, then everything in this world is beautiful. There is nothing ugly for me as a scientist also. I don't see any ugliness in this world. I see ugliness in the sense, means just now a question was raised about sufferings and tragedy and all sorts of exploitation, slavery, bondage, all these things where people do not have food to eat, water to drink. They are always tortured, enslaved, and for them aesthetics will be a luxury. That is proven fact. And there is a lot of literature on this also. We have Dalit aesthetics in Marxist aesthetics in India, and a counterpoint is always there. And it is also very deeply researched also, and it is getting more and more analyzed and popular as well. So basically, we need not take position, but we see a baby. We can't pass any judgment on the baby. The baby is a baby. A human baby, a human child, or a pup of a dog, or cub of a lion, it's just a innocent, you can see that birth. So can it be ugly ever? That's what I'm saying. Can it ever be ugly from any school of aesthetics? Fundamentally, I believe that it cannot be ugly. I am giving the answer. It cannot be ugly. A human baby can never be ugly, irrespective of caste, genes, religion, nationalities, creed, language, all these artificial walls which separate us. I believe from angle of aesthetics, no human baby can ever be ugly. Can you comment on this?
I completely agree. I don't see any disagreement with that. I don't see any problem here with this statement. I'm just saying that when Losev speaks about aesthetics, then it's about primarily human creativity, not the natural world. And well, naturally, when you are to see beauty in the natural world, of course, you will see it, in particular in babies, human or animal.
Yes, Dr. Koshi.
Just another last question from me. I was just again wondering, because of this tradition, as you rightly clarified, the sense of phenomenology in which, Losev writes is not the same as Husserlian and Merleau-Ponty, but still keeping the larger obvious. I mean, appreciating that even within phenomenological school, there are differences between Husserlian, Merleau-Pontian kind of phenomenology. I'm raising this question. Given that we have already in phenomenological school the idea of embodied consciousness, with Merleau-Ponty and all, would it be also, correct to see, if I look into Losev's writings as a kind of an embodied language, the kind of, because again, it goes back to the notion of speech, but not necessarily in the sense of speech act, but the whole idea of language there is also something, phenomenologically speaking, an embodied language that he is putting forth. That's just another.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Koshi. Yes, absolutely. This is an embodied language of a particular kind. That's why Losev is so much into logos taken as a language, philosophy of language, and therefore language of architecture, language of you name it, any art is an embodiment exactly of human thought, human creativity. So yes, absolutely, I agree with you.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
For any further questions, you all can get in touch with Dr. Lyanda-Geller through her email. Her email address is there in the chat box. I now request Sagar to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Sia. Thank you, Dr. Olga Lyanda-Geller, for this amazing session and speech on Losev. Let me also thank Dr. Kaushik Tharkan, Dean of our School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, all the faculty members for their presence throughout the event, and the research scholars working at Goa University, and those who helped with the poster design and even promotions. And last but not the least, all the participants, including faculty members, students, also students from outside Goa University. Thank you so much for your presence. Thank you, Sia, for letting me speak. Over
Thank
to you.
you. Thank you, Sagar. With this, we have come to the end of this event. The recording of this lecture will be posted on our school's YouTube channel, that is Philosophy at Goa University, and we will be back next month with another online guest lecture. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.